Hey, Knock, you ain't got sound.
I should have sound. That's gonna suck. All right, just a second.
Hey, chat, can anybody hear the music? Because we can't.
Should. The settings are good. I can't see the chat right now. We'll see. Hopefully, I don't have to start everything over. Go to the other intro.
Chat says no music. That had music.
All right, that had music, so that was good. It must just be the screen share. So something I got to work on the screen share to get music. But can you hear us, audience, please?
You probably need to turn your screen share off because all we can see right now is that.
There we go.
What's up? They could hear me talking and they did respond. They just couldn't hear the music. So maybe you have to do a window capture instead of a screen share. Maybe.
All right. So what's up, you sinners and saints? I just am messing with a bunch of new stuff, so forgive me. Think it's going to be better, but obviously I'm working on some new stuff that I'm just started working on today. I'm trying to do a million things at once. We're going to have a good show. Ali's here. Digital Hammurabi is here tonight. We're going to be interviewing them about what they're doing on their channel. I'm super excited because Dr. Josh is a really good friend. Digital Hammurabi is a really good friend of the channel, and you guys have been just super gracious to me. First off, what's up, Ali?
Hey, so I was actually super excited about this too, because over on SNS we have been working on debunks of some very crappy representations of Sumerian mythology. So I am chock full of questions about that. As everybody knows, we've been going at Spirit Science, and that video should be out within the next week or so. I'm almost done with the first edited video. I am terrible at editing because it's my first time, so apologies for how much it's going to suck, but at least the information's good. But yeah, welcome, Dr. Josh. Megan is currently a little bit busy. There was a little bit of miscommunication about the time, so she said she'll be here fairly shortly. But yeah, welcome to the channel. Do you want to come talk a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys very much for having me. Knox, good to be back on again. It's been a little while.
Yeah, it's been too long. I guess so OCD, Dr. Josh.
Oh, man. No, but we're Digital Hammurabi. I'm Dr. Josh. Megan is my wife. And she's sort of the brains and the brawn behind the channel. And we have a YouTube channel, Digital Hammurabi. We're both on Twitter. My handle is DJ Hammurabi1, and hers is Digi_Hammurabi. Cannot believe I remembered that. But our goal on the channel and on Twitter is to really try to bring good, reputable scholarship to non-specialists. That don't have the time to go get a PhD in these fields. So it's hard to know, I think, a lot of times, who can I listen to, who should I listen to, whom should I read, those sorts of things. And
well, not in the least, because there are charlatans who do have PhDs, but still, decide that they're gonna go ahead and promote some woo because it'll make them a quick buck. Yeah, and so like having like good reputable scholars that are willing to, even take some of those people on, I think is super important.
And I think that's sort of one of the big goals of the channel is to, because we want to guard against that as much as possible. Our goal is to present consensus scholarship. So you'll very rarely find us, I'm not saying that it doesn't ever happen, but very rarely will you find us coming out with something new or controversial in the sense of the majority of scholars in the field saying something. And this is now Megan.
Hi, sorry.
Hey, Megan.
Hey, Megan, you are looking fly. I love your hair.
Oh, thank you.
She didn't say anything about my hair.
Well,
well, it looks different than the last time I saw you.
It's grown out a bit. That's probably. probably.
Yeah, the last time you guys were here, like your hair looked a lot different. It looks gorgeous.
Thank you.
How are our audio levels? Is it okay?
Yeah, you're about where we are.
Cool. Yeah, so I was just talking about the channel. So that's one of the things we do is we try to present consensus scholarship. So, for example, the Daniel video series that we just put out, even though it might seem like the dating of Daniel is something that's really controversial, it's not. Consensus scholarship is very firm, and that's, you know, liberal and conservative scholars alike. So that's what we try to do, is we try to say, what is it that the majority of scholars in the field are saying about topics, which is a very comfortable position to be in, because see, if you prove us wrong, if you're going to prove us wrong, you have to prove like the whole of scholarship wrong, which is fine.
Which would be very exciting.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
We get ancient alien theorists occasionally, and my response is, please prove us wrong, because that would be spectacular. It would be possibly the most exciting thing to happen in Assyriology forever.
Yeah, and we might try to like steal the idea and make a bunch of money off of it, but you know, I'm just kidding.
Well, and it's funny because, you know, I've talked about that a little bit in the past, because I got sucked into that ancient astronaut theory crap when I was in my 20s and stuff, and I read what's his what's his, I can't remember his name. That's
Daniken.
Chariots of the Sky in the Sky. Or what?
I actually have an old, like, original copy of Chariot of the Gods, just because
Chariot
one
of
of
the
my
Gods.
friends gave it to me.
And
Like,
you
I don't
don't
believe
think
it,
about
but
it.
it's funny.
Like, it gets in your head. Oh, they make the case so plain, and this is clearly what all the, you know, historians are finding, and then no, there's a real field involved here that is actually offended by your stupid conspiracies.
Well, and this is actually a great place to start the discussion, I think, because, you know, in much the same way that you guys debunk like bad scholarship, we tend to debunk a lot of bad arguments. There's a concept, like, my background is in nutrition. I didn't finish my degree. I've talked about why before on the channel, but I have enough education to be able to talk about some things on a semi-authoritative level, right? Like, I'm not going to claim I've got a master's degree, but I went through a master's program. And one of the things that I see a lot, you know, in that field and in a number of different fields is when it's politically advantageous for somebody to do so, or when they think it'll make them a lot of money, they will manufacture scientific discontent. They'll cite the one or two studies and say scientists don't agree. You see it a lot with climate change. You saw it with, like, you know, cancer and cigarettes. You've seen it with the sugar industry and whether or not fat causes certain problems, which that's still, the science is still not confirmed one way or the other on that, despite what some people would like you to believe nowadays. So, like, what would you guys have, like, have you experienced that in your field, apart from the ancient alien theorists, and what would you guys say, you know, is sort of the driving force behind that, like with history?
I mean, not necessarily our specific field. I mean, yeah, we get the ancient alien guys. They don't tend to manufacture scientific arguments as much as just ignore that the field exists altogether, and come up with their own weird and wonderful explanations for various iconography or particular mythologies, and they do a great line in reading myth as literal historical fact, which was not something I had come across and was absolutely fascinating. So we
it's
don't
so
get
obvious
that so much.
if you just look at it. It's so obvious.
Exactly. It's like, I mean, what you're saying is very compelling, and I would love for it to be true because I'm a huge sci-fi nerd. I would love for there to be aliens. That would be amazing. The problem is that the myth you're trying to use as an example for the alien creation of humanity is, like, we have very clear dating of it. We know why it was composed. There's a very clear human political reason behind it. It's not that mysterious when you look at the context surrounding the evidence that they give you. The problem is that these people just don't give the context at all. They just pluck evidence out of different time periods and in a lot of cases, different cultures. Because Mesopotamia covers a large geographical area, a very large time period. They just kind of pick and choose interesting things that they can put together and use as to kind of create this narrative.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought that up, because prior to the stream, I was actually talking to Dr. Josh about on SNS, we're working on debunking a series which you guys might want to look at if you want to do a debunk of your own at some point, or if you'd like to collab on that, because Spirit Science is a pretty dang big channel. And I was surprised when Dr. Josh said he hadn't heard of it before, because they have they had over 1 million subscribers at one point. They might have less now. Because there was a big stink involving Telltale calling them out as a potential cult, and I think they lost some after that. But they have something that they call the Sumerian Epic, in which they combine myths from like Babylonian, Assyrian, and Sumerian mythology, and they try to create this overarching narrative that they then tie together with Zecharia Sitchin's and his theories. And it's really slickly animated. Like, we make comments at the beginning of our first video about how how the animators are like, we hope that they're not true believers and that they're getting paid well because their work is gorgeous. But the problem is when you have information this misleading packaged so slickly like that, like you also get with things like PragerU, then you end up with people believing that sort of misinformation. So, like, do you guys want to go in a little bit as to why it's probably not the best to combine Babylonian, Assyrian, Sumerian, etc., and talk about it like it's a monolith?
If we could, is somebody watching this animal?
Huh?
Is there supposed to be somebody dedicated to
the dog?
Is Paige supposed to be watching the dog?
No.
Okay.
He's been out. He's okay.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. The dog is a puppy and it chews on electric cables. That's what it likes to do. And I'd like the stream to continue with us in it.
This is why I never got a puppy.
That was sensible of you. So yeah, the problem with, do you want me to hold him?
Maybe.
The problem with combining all these different mythologies is that, especially very early in Mesopotamian culture, what you get is each city has its own individual pantheon, and individual stories that go with those gods, and it's very, very diverse. And as history, I mean, I am generalizing wildly because we're covering like 3,000 years of history here. But as history continues, generally speaking, these individual cities kind of combine into kingdoms and empires, and their mythologies and their religions get syncretized. Yeah. And
well, you see that with ancient Greece too, right? Like, there are epithets for the Greek gods. Like Poseidon Hippopotes is a particular epithet that was only used in one particular coastal city-state, and it is what associated him with horses. But that worship was not done everywhere uniformly throughout Greece.
Right.
So yeah, that was fairly common in the ancient world. Like, we talk about things like they're monoliths, but quite often cities differed wildly from one another, even in things like festival calendars.
Oh, each city had its own calendar. Like, they're very individual.
Yeah.
So trying to say that you can even trace back a single tradition is wildly inaccurate. And taking all of those different stories, different myths that are quite often contradictory, it's just bad. It's very sloppy thinking.
Well, Elio Oppenheim wrote a book, a very popular book. Actually, we have a series summarizing it or going through it on the channel. What's the title? I love MS. It doesn't matter. Anyway, it's an introduction to Mesopotamia. And he has a chapter that's called Why a Mesopotamian Religion Should Not Be Written. That was a little extreme. His position was a little extreme. But nonetheless, the point was, did I come unplugged?
Is it Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization?
Yeah.
Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Google is your friend.
I have a whole video series on it. Like, I can't hide it, but anyway.
I do it, Dr. Josh, and it's just because I'm forgetful. So.
It's because we're old.
Yeah, I'm getting old. I didn't want to say it.
But his point is that, as Megan, was saying, and as you've been saying, that you're talking about 3,000 years of history and of the development of the religion, and I mean that's just from a written standpoint that we know of. So, and even if you look at it from the perspective of the way that the gods were thought of over the millennia. So originally the gods were thought of as just in Mesopotamia, they were just thought of like the cloud, that's a deity, the sun is a deity, lightning is a deity, but it was in the sense of there was no personification. There was nothing necessarily personal behind it. It was just that's the deity.
That natural force is
that's right.
Is divine.
But then as time went on, they became, anthropomorphized to a greater extent, and they became very similar to the kings, interestingly enough. So there was this great connection between the kings and the gods. And then later on, you had personal deities. And it's just, so the way that it morphs, I think, because it's a much broader set of mythological, in particular, texts that we can, that we have access to, it's easier and harder, I think, to nail down what we would consider maybe contradictions for this, or inconsistencies between the different mythologies in this context. But you can see the same sort of thing in the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible is in many ways arguing with itself.
Well, yeah, and partially because it was assembled effectively by committee over a number of years. Like, not all of those books were, originally considered to be sacred.
But I mean, even the redaction history, something that I wrote that book on slavery recently, and one of the things that I talk about in it is there are three main passages that talk about slavery in the legal texts, and one of them is Exodus 21, and there's another in Leviticus 25, and you can see pretty significant developments between Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25, and they're written at different times in different contexts
by radically different authors.
Yeah, and the developments there are not. It's not something that one should try to harmonize, because it's a distinction. It's a development. It's Leviticus 25 is saying Exodus 21 is no more, right? We don't do it that way anymore. We do it this way, and so I think that trying to identify and hold to this homogenous, as you say, this monolithic thing called Sumerian religion or Akkadian or Mesopotamian religion, I think is just to miss.
Kind of miss the points.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it. I think you can do it. It's just you have to ignore.
You'll miss a lot. And I think that, I think one of the things that having any sort of background or education kind of teaches you is the more you know, the more you figure out that nuance matters, and the more you don't know. You're more likely to admit what you don't know when you have any level of education on a topic. You know what I mean? And I know that that's kind of semi-ish common knowledge because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, but it really comes into view when you start to try to talk about something like, even if we were to say, try to discuss, Enki as a deity, okay, what era are we talking about?
Sure.
What city state are we talking about? What story are we talking about? What in what context?
Yeah.
If you were to just even bring up a single deity, even if we were to say try to talk about Zedeus, we have a way better written record on my religious side, and yet there's still so much.
Yeah. And I mean, even looking at a figure like Marduk, and Marduk in the Enuma Elish and Marduk in Aaron-Isham. I mean, they're very different descriptions, very different depictions. In Enuma Elish, he's like the god, and he beats everybody, and he's the only one that beats everybody by really not having to do much. And then in Aaron-Isham, he's sort of like this older, I don't want to say frail, but I mean, frail's probably not a far off term, and he's not the same deity. And so I think you're exactly right. And I think when you have to try to harmonize in this way, you end up with, I mean, we see it a lot, but you end up with very odd things. Like, and I don't want to go too far afield, but I mean, when you have to say, well, did Judas hang himself, or did Judas fall down and burst asunder? How did he die? You say, well, he hung himself, and then after a little while, he slipped through the noose and then fell off the edge of the cliff that he was hanging over. There, it harmonizes it. It's like, yeah, okay, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and you're forced into those positions when you have to do that type of harmonizations.
So there was some recognition of this sort of diversity in the ancient world, wasn't there? Like, again, like most of my knowledge comes from Greek and Egyptian mythology, but even within, Greek and Egyptian cultures, when people would visit, Greece or Egypt and they would write about it, they would not translate the names of the Egyptian gods or the Greek gods into like their deities. They recognized them as separate. I know there's a lot less writings for, any part of Sumeria, but I'm curious if there was something like that there as well.
You actually get the opposite. What you see is, less so with foreign deities, but they tend to associate unfamiliar deities, note similarities between the new deities and their own deities and say, oh, this is the Ishtar of Greece, for example, if they're talking about Venus, maybe. I don't know if that happens. I just plucked that example out of my head. But you see them taking the similarities and just kind of mapping them onto what they already know. But there's an interesting phenomenon, especially later, like the first millennium BCE, where you have, especially with the goddess Ishtar, there are different Ishtars in different cities. And even though they have the same name, even though they have the same characteristics, they're understood as being distinct deities. So they'll say the Ishtar of Nineveh and the Ishtar of Arbela, and you'll have both goddesses referenced in the same text.
There's something similar with Aphrodite. There was a much more vengeful, warlike Aphrodite in Sparta that has very particular characteristics, and then there was kind of the way that she was recognized throughout most of the rest of Greece. And you can see ancient authors grappling with that, and they did something similar where they would, give her epithets and talk about them as separate deities.
Well, I'm fascinated because to what Megan is saying about what the Sumerians did, kind of relating outside religions and just making it like part of their own. I think we just saw really G-Man do that on my stream last Thursday night. Like he literally just met Ali. She's a polytheist. And, oh, you believe in Zeus? Well, let me tell you about Zeus. Zeus is a demon.
Okay, so can you please define demon? Are we talking about demon in the sense of, say, the Babylonian demons, or are we talking about demon in the sense of, like, what era of demon are we talking about here, good sir?
See, like, I would want to take the opposite approach and go, wait a minute, let me get my notepad out. Hang on, because this is gold, I tell you.
Yeah. Oh man, I was laughing and crying a little bit.
Yes.
But I think this is what I like best about your channel. Your channel is one of the ones I actually watch on a regular. Now I often lurk because if I'm on a Raging Atheist, I don't think you guys, if you're having a very intelligent PhD guest on, needs a Raging Atheist comment in your chat. But if I'm on Nakatsuchi, I usually will. But I'm off. It's what I love about your channel is you're about the history, and you just want to relay the history, and you're going to bring the experts on that's in the field, that's whatever topic you're talking about. And those are what I really enjoy. I just wanted to interject and just say that I am a huge fan, even if I'm not always visible in the side chats. I do it for a reason.
Well, thank you. Like, I really appreciate that. And that's the interviews and trying to bring actual historical information is really why we're doing what we're doing, because I always use the comparison with Egyptology. Everybody knows about ancient Egypt. Everybody knows about the pyramids and the kings, and they're so present in our cultural understanding of history. But for whatever reason, Mesopotamia doesn't get the same recognition. And I'm biased, obviously, but it is just as fascinating.
Well, it is.
Finding that information outside of journals and outside of like $200 books is really, really difficult. You don't get documentaries, you don't get the TV shows, you don't get books written and aimed at like a more popular audience, which kind of exacerbates the problem, because if you don't have access to the information, you just don't know it exists. So
and like reconstructionists in our community actually talk a lot about that. Callan talks frequently about how difficult it is, like outside of digging into JSTOR, to get any information about, the gods that she worships. Yeah.
Well, and like you guys, I think it was like Sumerian mourning songs, or you guys read them together. I can't remember exactly what they were called. It was
Elements.
yeah. And I just found them so beautiful. And I was sitting there listening and just like, man, this is like poetry. But I would have never ever got to hear this if I didn't have your channel. I just never would have got to hear it. I would have never known about this. I'd have never been introduced to that. And I think that's by far what makes you guys a very superior channel. And I just hope you grow and grow and grow.
Thank you.
It's one of the things that sort of in that vein, and I really appreciate you saying that.
There's a 2-year-old
I don't know
upstairs
if you
going,
guys
Mama!
can hear that.
Oh yeah, I'm a dad. I understand.
We're having on in the near term, probably the next couple of weeks, Dr. Brendan Bentz, who works in like the late second millennium BCE, and one of the things that he writes on is like pre-Israelite Canaan. So this is a period that I think, and I was talking about this in the stream on MathPig's channel just before this. Little shout out to MathPig.
Yeah, what's up, MathPig?
But you know, it's a period of time that we actually have a fair amount of information for or about, but there are a lot of people that don't seem to know that that's true. So, and the reason that means anything, I think, in at least in our context, is that it's a period that there's so much debate about the biblical texts. So this is the period that the Israelite conquest is, purported to have happened, or that the Exodus from Egypt, those sorts of things. And so one of the things that we want to do is you hear an awful lot about the evil, wicked, horrible, terrible Canaanites, right, that lived in the land. And, they had to be completely eradicated because of how wicked and awful and evil they were. And I asked Dr. Bentz to come on and just to kind of talk a little bit about, and we still have to iron out the details, but to talk a little bit about who the Canaanites were. What do we know about them archaeologically, historically, textually?
Did they practice human sacrifice? Because the Israelites like to accuse a lot of culture of that.
Yeah, but see, the Israelites did it as well. I mean, so from a literary standpoint, those things carry so much weight with people. Like, oh my gosh, look, the Canaanites had to be wiped out because look how awful they were. And you say, well, guys, who's telling you that they were awful? Mm-hmm. The people that wiped them out, right?
Yeah,
I mean, like
the winners of war often write the history. Yeah.
So the idea that these Canaanites were these horrific people is something that needs to be challenged critically.
You see it today with you're at war with Islamic culture, so you go out of your way to demonize that culture and make it quite acceptable to wipe out as many of them as you possibly can.
We did a stream with Dr. Heath Durrell a little over a year ago, I would think, and he wrote a book, his publication of his dissertation. It was called Child Sacrifice in Ancient Israel. And what he's looking at is, what can we say about child sacrifice in that period of the ancient Near East? And, this idea that you had these wicked, awful people and that the Israelites would never do such a thing. It's just not the case. He makes the argument that,
well, and I mean, it almost seems like they're trying to cover up the fact that they did, because you have that story of, the king who was told to sacrifice his son, and at the last minute God tells him not to, but very clearly there's a reason that a story
Abraham
like that
himself?
existed.
Yeah, that was Abraham, right?
Yeah, so Abraham, and then but other interesting things that I don't think maybe people don't think about as often. Of course, I wasn't thinking about it until the interview. When the Moabite king goes up and sacrifices his firstborn son when the Israelites are attacking, and it works, right? The
well,
power
and don't we have the Moabite stone that also confirms that from their side too? So this is at least a partially historical event. Wasn't the god that he sacrificed to Chemosh? Like I think Ocean did a video on that.
Mm-hmm. And that's right. And so the Mesha inscription. And I guess my overall point with it is that when it comes to when it comes to getting scholars on the channel, I feel like people have this idea that we're out to disprove the Bible, right? In
I
fact,
wanted to go there with you. I'm glad that you're going there yourself.
I mean, Megan sort of made a
Digital Hammurabi. Why do you hate the Bible?
why do you hate the
Yeah,
Bible? You know?
Megan's a Christian, and think I've literally seen her be accused of not being a Christian.
Yeah.
Oh, many times. Someone
Yeah.
did it on Twitter like 2 days ago. I was like,
Yeah.
okay.
You're just an atheist, and that's why you say that. And not
Yeah,
that there's
it-
anything wrong with being an atheist, but I mean, it's like she's not. So
Yeah, you're not even an atheist,
No.
Dr. Josh.
and you know, maybe I would be if I. This is going to sound. Maybe if I would be if I thought about it more. But I just like I don't. This is also going to
It's
sound
not
bad.
that
I don't.
important.
Yeah, I don't know that I
Yeah.
care enough to think about it.
Oh,
that
I
much
ran
to
with a
become
raging
one.
atheist because I didn't think about it, and then once I did, I'm like, damn, I'm not an atheist. I'm kind of an agnostic. So
Well, I think this is an interesting place because I remember there was an interview you guys did a while back where you talked about mythological language, historical language, and like I think the other one was legal language that you were talking about. And you said that the layperson can't really distinguish between those, but that you can see that there's different language that's used in the Bible, there's different language that's used in these other texts. Do you guys want to kind of expand on that a little bit for our viewership? Because I think that this is where biblical literalists get kind of caught up a little bit with people having a chat about something like, say, whether Genesis was meant to be taken literally or, you know, whether Judges was. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so like we do in modern literature and modern writing, ancient writing has genres. So they have poetry, they have legal texts, they have historical texts that were supposed to be like a record of, that were supposed to be an actual record of historical events. But the problem is when you get to the Bible, because it's more difficult to recognize in a foreign language, to recognize in a translation, and especially in like ancient texts, it's more difficult to recognize the genres that are being represented, partly because we don't have some of those genres anymore.
Yeah.
We don't write mythology anymore.
We don't have conquest account.
Right. We don't
Genre.
sit down and I mean, generally speaking,
Well, I
don't
mean-
sit down and write how badly we beat someone up in a war.
Well, I think that there's a version of mythology that gets created nowadays, but you mostly only see it in things like cults, right? Like it's not a specific like set of language that you would use differently, but there is a version of that still exists.
I would maintain that Fox News puts out a lot of mythology. Oh, we're not going there.
You already
wouldn't
went there,
necessarily
Doc. You already did.
I think that, you know, it's always my go-to. But you know, that when David says day and night, I think I do this now just because I always
It's
do.
a good example.
But day and night, my tears have been my food, right? He's at a place where he's so sorrowful, he's so sad, and that's what he says. Day and night, my tears have been my food. You know, nobody says, all right, I'm going to write an article about
The nutritional value of tears.
or
and how long he could have survived like this for.
yeah, or dietary,
Mhm.
dietary practices in the ancient Near East. Nobody's going to do that because we have poetry today, and we recognize that as poetry.
I feel like that's a personal challenge, but just go on.
But I think that when we read, for example, when we read about the Israelites going in the book of Joshua and utterly wiping out, all the inhabitants of the land, and then they show up. These inhabitants show up again later. We don't necessarily stop and think, is that a genre of writing? You know, are there texts that speak this way? So if you read through conquest accounts, you know, this warlike language in the ancient Near East, particularly when they're put on royal inscriptions, it's doing so for a reason. The text is doing something, and the king will often say, "I absolutely obliterated. You know, no man was left alive," and
Well, it's like the
everybody's
language of propaganda for the modern day, right? Like there's different, when you read, say, and this is a very political example, but, like Knock and I talked about it recently. So I think it's apt. When we read Misha Popoff's article on LGBTQ stuff, one of the things that I pointed out repeatedly was that he equated gender and sex throughout without noting that he had done that, right? Yeah. Which anybody with education on the topic would, at the very least recognize that there is a scholarly recognized difference, like a scientifically recognized difference between the two. Not scholarly, sorry. But like when you do something like that in, say, a propaganda piece, there's a particular purpose behind it. So you're kind of talking about that when it comes to these war proclamations. There's a very particular rhythm and like tone of speech that is meant to convey a particular thing. And you can see that if you have that scholarly experience.
Yeah. And the thing is, you've got to, one of the things that does happen, unfortunately, is that someone will read a book about that particular topic and come away with an understanding that's not as nuanced as it needs to be. So, for example, I remember I talked about this on the very first Non Sequitur show that I went on, and that particular example about conquest account genre. Next thing I know, I'm seeing people use that to say that, using it in such a way to say that God didn't command everyone to be killed. It's just this genre of writing, and then that becomes blanket. It's just applied everywhere. So then you go to, the story about the Amalekites with Saul, and Saul is told, go in and wipe out the Amalekites, kill everybody, man, women, children, cattle, everything. We got to do something with this dog. Sorry. As much as I love him, he's yanking me all over the place.
You gotta love puppies.
No. I think. Oh, sounds like some of the kids got up.
Parenthood.
Yeah. But then they say, well, here, clearly, that's not what's meant. This is just conquest language. And so it's not really meant that they wiped out everybody. Therefore, this isn't genocide. Therefore, your problem of evil arguments fall apart, right? And the problem is that that's not allowing nuance. That's broadly applying something. It's like a kid with a hammer. Everything's a nail, and so.
And y'all take pains to explain that nuance and to try to make it aware. And even, like I remember when you first started interacting with Praise on the slavery issue, like you took great pains to say, Praise, you're not wrong. I can completely understand. You've got a very lame, you're trying here. You're trying to read these ancient texts, and I understand why you read it this way. But here, let me tell you why I am reading the words this way. Why I'm telling you it means this thing in this instance. And his response is, well, who are you to tell me I'm wrong? Not to mention, you're a PhD scholar, but outside of that, like you're literally like giving him all the ground that you can, like, hey, I understand, but here's the nuance of this word here. Let me tell you. And then you're just getting closed ears, but you go out of your way to make that distinction that this is a nuanced question and it requires a lot of explanation.
One of the things that I actually find interesting as you bring that up, is that I think that there is MathPig made the comment in the last stream that maybe I shouldn't be engaging with like certain people on Twitter or certain people on other forms of social media, whatever, because they're trolling or they're not really interested or whatever. And there's a lot of truth to that. There's no question. There's a lot of truth
I actually like your measured responses to the trolling, though.
He's much better than I am.
Well, the problem is that there are some people who aren't trolling who actually believe some of that crazy stuff. So having that measured response, at least once, like you don't want to respond every time, but at least once, that there might be value in that.
The nice thing about this, though, is, and I think I saw Praise earlier in the side chat. I kind of hope he's still there. Like we're actually at a pretty good place. We've been emailing a little bit.
Yeah, we're in a better place ourselves, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I just think I don't know. There's something to be said. There's obviously going to be certain people. There's certainly some people that I just they've come to a point that I think it's just bad to interact with them, frankly. And I'm thinking of two people in particular, but I won't say their names. But those are people that I just know that anything that I say, any ground that I give is it's counterproductive. But I mean, I think that there actually are certain circumstances where, here praise has actually been any time that I've talked to him, and I've said, well, I understand why you say that. Here's why I say this, and he agrees. He will say it, and he'll actually bring it up later, and say, yeah, Josh showed me that pointed this out to me. Of course, he's got something else that he disagrees with me on, which is fine. And actually, I'll stop talking about this, but I kind of like it's out of it's far afield here, but I kind of like the banter that he and I have to some degree. One, because I think it's very entertaining. I think it gets a lot of people watching his stuff, and but I think a lot of times it's in good fun. Sometimes
I've enjoyed it, and I agree. I think because it's gotten bad, it's been good. It's between our personal
Praise
relationship.
is more mellow with you guys than he is with anybody else.
We've debated quite a few times, but I think we're actually in a better position. We had, I think it was it wasn't a private conversation. I went on his stream. We talked out our issues, and I do find him to be reasonable. I mean, I hate a lot of the crap he says, but he is reasonable, and he is willing to admit like mistakes and say he's wrong. You don't get that a lot. I think I enjoy him more now than I did at first.
Yeah. And I do think that he thinks through his position.
Oh yeah. He's not stupid. I don't think you can.
No, not at all. And I guess
I think there's a challenge when you're working with a translation without all of that extra historical context, knowledge, etc., that a PhD will introduce you to the concept that you're lacking it. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have all of those answers just because you have a PhD, but you at least are introduced to the idea that you need it at all. And I think that, this is something that I'd compare it as the difference between Reconstructionists and, some of the other modern religions, is that need to understand from a historical context what these things are. I think it's lost on a lot of people because a lot of people are afraid it'll challenge their faith if they change what their beliefs are in regards to new information, right? Like, scholarship can seem threatening, and I think that that's ultimately hurting people's faith.
Yeah.
Clearly, because you guys can remain even somewhat religious, understanding all that you do, it's clear that it doesn't have to eliminate your faith, that if anything, it can enrich it.
Yeah. Well, you can probably comment on that more than I can.
I think I'm probably in a different place than a lot of, especially American Christian people, because I was raised with a very loose reliance on the Bible as a text. Like, the Anglican denomination doesn't, we read the Old Testament, but it's more just something you do rather than something you take your morality from. And really the overriding theme of my religious upbringing was God loves people, be nice.
Yeah, there are some religious branches in the US that are like that, but they're not the loud, angry ones that are trying to change stuff.
Exactly. So the fact that, the Bible is fallible. I don't think the Bible was divinely inspired. I don't think that Genesis is historical fact, but I didn't believe that stuff going into the PhD program. So learning about the real history, that is in contradiction with the history the Bible presents, wasn't this massive, groundbreaking, earth-shattering shock for me, the way I think it was for Josh, having had a much more fundamental upbringing.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and it doesn't have to them either. They can realize, hey, this is history and this is great because, instead of disabusing me of my God, we're seeing the real history here play out, and God could have been a part of that. And, this book doesn't have to be perfect. I don't have to base my perception of God upon this book. I can accept what history is saying. And maybe if more did that, then we wouldn't need people like me ranting and raving all the time.
Well, and that actually gives me a really great place to transition into a question I'm sure you guys get a lot, but I would love to hear kind of an expansion on this. And that is, a lot of people, and I warned Dr. Joss that this was coming and that it was probably going to be boring, but we have people in our audience that had actually requested to talk about this a little bit. So when a lot of debunkers go after the Bible, they go after the assertion that this flood myth was unique or that other cultures had actually copied it from the Israelites, etc. Do you guys want to go a little bit into the Epic of Gilgamesh is the one that everybody cites, but there are older flood myths too. In fact, I was listening to which, by the way, beautiful reading of it that I heard you guys do on your channel, but I was listening to the Sumerian flood myth. The people were doing this clamor and it pissed the gods off, and the gods were like, we're going to get rid of everybody, and then it kind of cuts off because there's not a lot left of the text. But first off, commentary coming from a culture with an oral tradition, that rhythmic triple repetition was very noticeable throughout. And there's a version of that is done in my culture in a Haida oral tradition. There's particularly certain orators and certain families of orators. There's wansuga, which is, they say, that's kind of a refrain at the end of a lot of sentences, or bits will be repeated, or there will be 3 different versions of exactly the same story. And I noticed that they did something like that in this, where you have people repeating exactly the same phrase, so you can kind of hear the orator learning the story as you're reading it off. And hearing that written is so strange to us, but like if you're used to that, that's beautiful. But anyway, I rambled for a second. Coming back to, do you guys want to talk a little bit about some of the similarities and differences between those flood myths and kind of what the scholarly opinion seems to be on why they exist? Because I think that this is something that gets misrepresented a lot on both sides of the religious argument. So I'd love to hear like where you guys are coming from and what you understand of it.
Do you want to?
No, you should start. I'll be right back.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Check something.
So, yeah, we have a few different variants on that particular myth. Like you said, there's the Sumerian narrative, which is unfortunately quite fragmentary, but does exist, is a relatively early text. I can't give you an exact date because I don't have it in front of me, but it's an early one. And
there were lots of places where it was just like ... and like half a sentence. Yeah. And it was like my husband was listening to it with me and he was like, what's going on now? I'm completely lost.
Yeah. And that is a pretty good feeling for how Assyriology works. so much of what we have. Sorry.
What?
Oh, I said welcome to the madhouse.
Oh,
it was a joke that I tossed when you guys first came in.
So many of the texts we have. So cuneiform, for those who don't know, is written on, generally speaking, clay tablets, which survive very well in the archaeological record, far better than things like papyrus do, which is why we have quite so much textual evidence. But they don't survive perfectly. So if you have a broken tablet, or you have a tablet where like some of the surface has been worn away or chipped away, obviously you get these big gaps in the narrative. And if you only have one example of that particular text that has been excavated, there's nothing to look to fill in the gaps. With things like Gilgamesh, we have enough different copies that even if one tablet is partially broken, we have another tablet that matches it, so you can kind of fill in the gaps using that. So yeah, the Sumerian flood narrative is pretty fragmentary, but it exists. It's a very early form of the flood myth. And then, like you said, Gilgamesh has kind of like a retelling of the floods. And there's another text called Atrahasis, which is a much more complete, just a pure flood narrative that also has some striking similarities to the biblical account. And I think what is the thing that, and I did a video series on this because it bugs me quite so much. The thing that really bothers me when people look at these earlier myths that are like, they do predate the earliest accounts we have from Genesis. There is very good evidence to suggest that this idea of a flood narrative was picked up during the exile. And then the Hebrews were, the account in Genesis is a response to the Mesopotamian mythology. It's their way of saying, actually, this did happen, but it was our God, and our God is better than your God, and Yahweh has all of the power. I've completely lost where I was going with that.
Oh, you were going to talk about
Plagiarism.
Plagiarism.
But the thing that often gets trotted out by anti-theists is that it's the Bible has plagiarized, and that bothers me not as a person of faith, but as an historian, because that puts modern moral judgments onto an ancient practice that is completely different.
It's very
well, it's an entirely different cultural thing, right? Like in Japan, for example, when you want to learn how to do a certain style of, say, ink painting, you copy the works of the masters until you perfect them.
Mhm.
Like the idea of originality is valued differently in that particular practice. You get something, it's a very different worldview.
Well, this is exactly why I started to change my personal anti-theism, because I made a lot of trolls, and I would do it. I would compare Jesus to I don't know, Horus, or I would I would talk about the plagiarizing and how the Jews just stole this myth, but I knew better and I was just trolling. And the problem is a lot of people don't, and they actually think that this is true, and they just stole. No, it's not, and it really isn't healthy to the conversation at all. And so that's why I really try to change my personal stances, how I'm approaching people with these things, what I'm personally saying, because how you say things matter, and you just really make yourself look like a fool, because no, they didn't. It's not plagiarism. They pretty much took the stories and said our God did this. Basically.
Yeah, it's actually quite a complex and sophisticated reuse of the motif, but this is something that you see throughout the whole of Mesopotamia. People taking an existing story, like Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a perfect example. The Gilgamesh epic that most people know, that they may have read, is based on much earlier material, a set of Sumerian myths. And whoever compiled, well, the author who compiled the Gilgamesh epic, the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, took those myths, took various like themes and aspects of them, and wove them into a single narrative, and made something new and interesting, that kind of,
it's doing something else.
yeah. It's not just straightforward copying, because that's kind of boring, if we're very honest. If you just like write out something that someone else did, I'm with you with the artistic way of doing it. It's a great way to learn. But when you're taking a pre-existing collection and you're reworking it and reforming it to create something new, that's actually quite difficult to do. And it's very, very common in Mesopotamia, in various ancient cultures. It's not the negative that we associate plagiarism with today, because that was how
my example would be Frank Herbert and his son. Like, is I can't remember his son's name, but is his son carrying on the stories and creating new content for these stories? Is that plagiarism? And I would maintain that it's not. That despite my trolling in the past, I knew better, and I contributed to this poison. So I'm actually glad you gave me a chance to talk about this, because if you know better, you shouldn't. And I probably added to maybe some people's misconceptions of what actual fact is.
Well, and as an author and a creator myself, like, that's what I did before I came onto YouTube, is I write fiction. It is impossible to separate yourself from the media that you have consumed, in the stories that you've heard, etc. To some degree, everybody plagiarizes a tiny bit, in the sense that certain themes and ideas and even sentences will come up in your work over and over. Like, there's a distinct difference between what you define as plagiarism, which is the wholesale stealing, versus recreating, like you're talking about. But to a certain degree, you cannot separate yourself from what you've already consumed.
If you go down that line of thinking, right? Like, say Lord of the Rings was the first fantasy epic ever, and that means, Wheel of Time is plagiarizing all of these things are just taking what Lord, it just doesn't make much sense. So yeah, I totally agree with you on this. And as I said, it really poisons the conversation, and it's designed to trigger emotions from theists that don't even, you're going against everything, their core beliefs, and it's designed to just kind of turn a knife in that. And that's poison. It's toxic.
And the thing is, it goes the other direction as well.
Oh yeah, it does. Yes.
So one of the things that I think is worth saying is, if you think about the book of Daniel, I've had to deal with that a lot recently as well. People that adhere to an early date of composition will often say, "Oh, you just think that this author lied and tried to fool or dupe people," right? This second century author is saying, "I'm Daniel," and he's lying and he's trying to dupe people. And he writes a fake book and to fool people. And the interesting thing about that is that the idea of pseudonymity, I don't think carries, those are very modern understanding of why it is that someone would do that. So why is this second century compiler, group of compilers, we don't really know, why are they doing that? Why is he or she or whatever why are they doing that? And it's not because there's some insidious, sorry, the dog is like wrapping himself around me, which is making it hard to concentrate, which is why this is taking 15 minutes. Please stop. I don't remember what I was saying.
You were saying there's not some insidious like plot around it. There's no deliberate deception here.
Yeah, well, but see, deception is it's the type of terminology that we're using. The second century author is most certainly knows that he is not Daniel, right? And in the same way that the writer of the book of no, that's go too far afield. Sorry. That's because of the world. Anyway, the point is, this is really hard to do with a dog here. I'm really sorry.
Oh no, it's quite fine, Dr. Josh. I understand.
So you're saying the idea of deception, in this case, is a more modern one.
Yeah, because the ill intent that comes behind is it's fake. He's trying to dupe. He's trying to trick. No, what he's doing is he's utilizing a literary technique that allows this second century audience that's going through intense persecution to be able to say, we can hold on, we can withstand, we can take this persecution and deal with it because deliverance is right around the corner. And the reason that we can know that is because Daniel wrote this thing however many hundreds of years ago, and all these things have come true. So this idea that we're assigning to it, it's a very much a nuanced thing. So if somebody says to me, yeah, well, you're just saying that the author lied is a word that has nuances that I don't think I would apply to this.
Well, it's the difference between a connotative and a denotative definition here. There's connotations to the word lie that imply a certain degree of malice, and that's not what you're saying happened.
Exactly. Yes, that's a perfect way to say it. You should have couldn't you have just barged in and said, Josh, shut up. This is what you're trying to say. And that would have...
Welcome to my life, Dr. Josh. This is why I made her a co-host. So.
Well, I was trying to let you speak to make sure that you could get to your point. I know you were distracted, but that's me as an author saying connotative and denotative, because it's something that we run into a lot. When I get into debates quite often, I will try to establish, there's my stretch alarm. Hey, congratulations, everybody. You're on a Naka stream. That I have a back injury that I'm dealing with, and there's alarms that go off every hour that tell me to go do back stretches. So as soon as I mute and ask another question to let you guys talk for a sec, I'm going to go do that. I'll still be able to hear you though, because I'll have my headset on. But yeah, that's something when I get into debates, I try to establish shared definitions for especially nebulous concepts like, say, lie, which a lot of people think it's clear cut. But if you tell only part of the truth, is that a lie? There have been entire essays, written over thousands of years over what the hell a lie means. If you're talking about freedom, if you're talking to a Democrat or a Republican, you're going to be getting two very different conversations about what freedom means. When you have words that have been turned into dog whistles for one community and, mean something quite literal to a different one, you get that sort of problem overall. Yeah. And so when you're talking about whether or not there's malice, that's an undertone to a conversation that isn't explicitly being said because you're not working with agreed upon definitions.
Yeah. well, real quick, Dr.
Yeah,
Josh, like
sure.
like even when I'm talking, because I'm doing a lot of the research on Paul, and I know Lisa in the chat wanted me to ask you if you have knowledge on the rift between Paul and James, if you would come on her channel and talk about that, because she's looking into it too. But even then, when I was talking to Paulo Gia about it, and he was like, it's not that we're saying that it's not like they stole the religion. It's just that Paul won, and that's how the religion became. So it's not like malice. I don't even want to say, like, when I'm talking about Paul, like, I think that Paul was doing an evil thing in his mind, because I think quite clearly he was probably doing what he thought was best for the religion he cared about. So that's something that I too have wanted to catch myself, like, be clear about what I'm trying to present here. I'm looking at a time in history, and I'm trying to be very, very accurate, and even then make mistakes. So recognize that mistake. Next video, let's be clear. I'm not trying to say he stole anything, that he's the Antichrist of Christianity. I'm just talking about a piece of history that I am looking at and fascinated by.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so I think that in all of that, coming to these types of discussions and being able to say, another really good example of this would be slavery, right? And so many people, that becomes a real sticking point. It feels like both sides often in this debate want to make a connection between slavery in the Hebrew Bible and antebellum slavery. Uh, there was no slavery in the Hebrew Bible side is doing that to say, look at the huge gulf that exists between what is depicted here in Exodus 21 and what happened in antebellum slavery. The other side, there was slavery in the Hebrew Bible, is saying, look, there's slavery, and we have slavery in in antebellum South, and so we know how horrible that was. That means this is just as horrible, or whatever. And there's nuance to both of those positions, but just I saw something in the side chat. Absolutely, there's no question, so that everybody knows. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible endorses slavery, just so everybody knows that.
I think we're in agreement.
It was different than, like slavery that we would recognize, say, in the American South, but it still was slavery. Like, slavery still strips somebody of their humanity and their rights to a certain degree.
Yeah, and I mean, we could talk all stream about this, but so probably shouldn't get me started on it, but
well, we could talk at length for whatever you're interested in. Which reminds me, if you can get me a link, say on Discord or Twitter or something, to your book, I'll make sure that gets in the description, because I got your channel in there, but I didn't get a chance to put your book in there because Nock didn't tell me.
Yeah, I am terrible with links.
I suspect some of the mods on your channel.
I'm sure one of them's going to go find it now that I've said something.
yeah, the mods are usually pretty good. So I think that I know they've been putting the link to Digital Hammurabi's channel.
We have a really awesome community. I don't know if it's something I was going to say.
Amazing.
That is something I was going to say actually on the last stream and forgot. I apologize, Math Pig, but I'll say it here. We were talking about my prior faith and morality and behavior and those sorts of things tied to it. And one of the things that I have found incredibly interesting for the 2 years that we have been on social media is that I have found the skeptical, the atheist, agnostic, whatever you want to say, community to be vastly kinder, vastly more kind and generous.
Oh, there we go. There's the link. Thanks, RCA.
Perfect. Thank you. Than the community out of which I came, right? The fundamentalist evangelical community. And you would think that the opposite would be the case, right? The people that want to win the lost for Christ would be very forgiving and very generous and kind and patient. And I'm certainly not trying to suggest that everyone in the skeptical community is an angel and that, has never meaned anyone or whatever. But on the whole, my interactions, when I disagree, slavery is one of these things that will draw disagreement from both sides, right? With me, which is fine.
Yeah, this is something that I, ended up nailing Sygard on, like when we had our debate. Like that's a thing that almost anybody will end up talking about, right?
Yeah, Oh, good. Sorry.
It's one of those, like, when you believe that the Bible is the absolute final authority on all morality for the rest of eternity, like, when you're making a statement that bold and that hard, people are going to go at you on things like that, and on, like, the age of consent for marriage and things like that. Like, the problem is, I think, when you take a position that is so incredibly hard-lined, like, and I'm speaking of not you specifically, I'm speaking of most of the apologists that, say, Knock and I deal with on a daily basis, because I've gotten a lot grumpier since I started working on this channel. Like, you know, when you take such a hardline position that it's absolutely 100% foolproof truth and the final word of authority, which in that debate, I did ask Sygard if he believed that, and he said yes. Like, at that point, you open yourself up to those kinds of contentious conversations and trying to backpedal and trying to justify away historical truth. Like, I think that we're back to the problem of not having nuance, right?
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think I'll go back to something that Heath Durrell said, the guy that came on and talked about child sacrifice in ancient Israel. You know, he's up at Princeton, and I think he's Episcopalian. And he said, I'm on the more conservative side of scholarship. And he said, I think there probably was a Moses. So probably was a Moses is the more conservative side. Like, not that Moses was the person that you see described in the Hebrew Bible, but that there probably existed a person whose name was Moses, that the figure is based on, right? And he said, you know, one of the things that I see is that the Hebrew Bible argues with itself. It's very rabbinic in that sense. You have competing ideas.
Which makes sense, because it's from the rabbinical tradition, right? Like, it comes from a culture very different than the one that's trying to interpret it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly developed into it. And I think that, you know, the text sort of was very appropriate, I think, for it to develop into that tradition, that interpretive tradition. But, you know, not that I'm a rabbinic expert. That's not what I'm saying. But the point, I guess, is that I think that when one gets to a point where they can say, I allow for nuance, I allow for there to be contradictions here. I don't have to harmonize everything. Not everything has to agree. It allows you to really move forward, you know, as far as scholarship is concerned, because you can then say, well, what did this mean?
Well, I think that's when you're...
sorry, Ellie, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that the problem for a lot of the folks that we end up dealing with, and this might offend some of our more hardcore Christian viewers or, you know, folks that we've had on the channel, but this is something that Knock and I have expressed before, so I don't think it's new for our channel. I think that there is a certain level of personal identity that gets tied into the us versus them narrative and to the absolute firmness of a thing. Like, when you're raised to believe there is one absolutely infallible word that is divinely inspired and it is one truth and you can hold on to that to let go of that can be absolutely terrifying from a personal identity and internal integrity standpoint, like even from a psychological standpoint. Mm-hmm. So I think that this is a conversation that's difficult to have, and there's a certain level of understanding that needs to be exercised within that, even while we're taking them to task for the shitty things that come out of that, right?
Well, and I was going to say, I think that this is probably why you get attacked by a certain element of Christians, way that you guys do.
Because I don't believe in their God.
It's because you are bringing nuance and history to the conversation, and it's hard to have nuance when God is supposed to have done everything and the Bible is supposed to be perfect. So it's probably why that certain element of Christians would come at you guys in the way that they do. Like, I understand why they come at me the way they come at me, but it's because actual history challenges that literalist nature. So you're going to get people that consider that to be a threat. Well, I don't want nuance. I want my interpretation to be the perfect one. And what I like about you guys is you're not going at religion at all. Like, that's not the point of your channel. You're simply talking about the history of this, you know, area of the world, 3,000 years ago, and as best as you can. And it's it has nothing at all to do with that, and yet they do take offense. I find that's probably why I keep coming back to the chats, because it happens.
Well, it's because it's threatening and scary, like we just said.
Yeah.
You know, Dr. Joss, I noticed you raised your hand when I talked about that. Like, would you like to expand on that a little bit? Because clearly that seems to be a thing that you've gone through.
Oh yeah, I mean, so you know, I'm sure everybody listening knows, but you know, I grew up a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, and it was the core of my existence, to the point that if I was driving somewhere and I got a parking spot, even if it was, you know, to like Walmart or something where there was likely to be a parking spot, I would say, Lord, thank you for this parking spot. You know, you provided this. You know, it was to that level. And in all sincerity,
that sort of self-indoctrination where, like, you credit God for every literal thing in your life, like that, you know, in order to reinforce that.
yeah. And but the thing is, it was because God was completely in control, in his omnipotence, and all things went according to his plan. Then everything that happened in life was was part of his plan. And so, you know, things like, I mean, I remember when I was in the service, leaving to go to, you know, my shift out on the flight line. And you're supposed to be there 15 minutes early. You know, if you're 10 minutes early, you're 5 minutes late, sort of thing. And uh, I ran out of the house 2 minutes later than I anticipated. And I said, I'm not going to speed because it's wrong to speed. And I'm going to obey God's laws because God has placed these laws here for us, and powers that be are there because he has allowed it. And so if I'm late, you know, I'm still going to do what's right. And God, if he wants me there on time, will make that happen. I mean, that's how I lived my life. It was the core of my, to say that it was my worldview is quite an understatement. So when I got to Hopkins, and had to confront at a very high intellectual level, some of these inerrancy positions, this inerrancy position that I held, you know, with respect to the biblical text, this hermeneutic that I had, you know, it really was well, if that's not true and that's not true and that's not true, well, then it's all bullshit.
Well, yeah, there's that black and white thinking that sort of upbringing engenders.
And I've seen, I saw a tweet, I think it was today or yesterday, where like people literally, and I get this a lot because I think they have to try to take away the beginning of your journey to dismiss it. But people literally saying you weren't that type of Christian, that you weren't this. And I mean, it's really insulting, I would have to imagine, because
that's a manifestation of that same black and white thinking.
Yeah, I'm personally proud of my journey. And if you take away the beginning of that journey from me, and people do all the time, oh, you weren't a real Christian, there's no way you were a real Christian. You know, that's like it. You try not to let it insult you, but it does. And you're like, you're dictating to me what my life was and how I once tried to live it. Like, you don't know me. And I saw that, and I had that personal relation moment. Like, man, that's happened to me all the time. And it gets to you. I think it gets in your guts a little bit.
I wanted to, if it's okay, sort of in that vein, I'd like to read one of the responses. So
Sure, feel free.
So I'll just, it was like 4 tweets, so it'll take a second, but it's specifically in response to that allegation, that accusation that I really never was a Christian. So this guy who's actually turned a corner with me, which is nice, but he wrote, have you come to a place in your spiritual life where if you were to die tonight, you would know that you would go to heaven? And 2, if you were to die tonight and stand before God and he were to say to you, why should I let you into heaven? What would you say? Of course, these are some of the most common questions that you hear. Because he was telling me I was never really a Christian. So this was my response. I have absolutely no obligation to explain my faith experience to you, but I will anyway. Yes, I realized that I was a sinner, not because of any particular sin, but because in Adam, I was born with a sin nature. I also realized that the wages of sin was death, to be eternally separated from God in hell. I also realized that because God is holy and just, my sin could not simply be overlooked. It had to be paid for. Because I was a sinful man, I could not pay the penalty for my own sin. However, Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, had come into this world and died on the cross to take the full penalty for my sin. He did this by his grace, not because of any righteous works that I had done. I knew that if I simply trusted in the finished work of Christ on Calvary and not in my own good works, that I could and would be cleansed from my sin, cleansed of my sin, born again, and be justified in the sight of God. All this would be through simple faith in his shed blood, for it is by grace that one is saved through faith. Having believed, I knew that I had been indwelled by the Holy Spirit, who sealed me until the day of redemption. I was eternally secure in my position in Christ. Had I died and been asked why God should let me into heaven, I would have said, only because Jesus Christ died on the cross to pay the penalty for my sins, and I trusted in him for my salvation. That response prompted him to say, I was wrong. You were
That's
saved.
awesome. That's awesome.
And it's, I don't really have any, I'm irritated by those types of responses, but I understand them because, as you were saying, Allie, it's a terrifying proposition to see someone who could say something like that, right? Not that I'm like special or anything because I could present the gospel, but
for people like that, for whom Christianity is this very, very specific set of beliefs, and you have to believe in the right way and behave in the right way, to have someone who meets every single one of your criteria who has still walked away is terrifying. Because if this person can believe so completely and be what I consider a true Christian, I'm not a true Christian, by the way, for those who were wondering. I don't fit the right boxes.
Matt Powell doesn't think you're a real Christian.
He can go fuck himself.
And you know what? We're not monetized anymore, so we don't have to worry about that.
I think you just made my new soundboard.
Congratulations.
To have someone like Josh who does fit that profile, or did fit that profile so perfectly, and they still walked away. It's like, well, what how do you reconcile that? What do you do with that?
Yeah, I think that's, outside of his great abilities to argue, but I see so many people just rail at Matt Dillahunty, so many Christians, and they live through IP because IP can actually sit there and have a legitimate conversation with a man, right? And so they live through him vicariously. And I think that the reason that they hate them, that not hate is a strong word, but the reason they dislike Matt Dillahunty in specific so much was because he was that Southern Baptist, and he can sit there and tell you how it was and how he thought and believed, and it's hard to run away from that because he'll tell you just exactly what you're thinking right then if you ask the same question. It's where me, I always admit, I was never a real Christian, never a real Christian. We just pretended.
So now that we've been on this incredibly heavy topic,
I don't want to keep them too long, Allie. We're going to let them get out of here before too long.
Well, I wanted to let them have a little bit of fun really quick, if you guys would like.
Sure.
So I know that both of you have some fairly heavy backgrounds in, history and like scholarship and such. I wanted to give you guys, since we just went into this really deep topic, a little bit of a lighter fare. What is the most and I want to hear from Misha first, because you have not gotten to talk very much for a while. What's the most exciting discovery that you are currently following in your field? And what is the topic within your field that fascinates you the most personally? And then after that, Dr. Joss, you can go. Yeah, you got to pick one, maybe two. I might give you two. I know it's hard, but
it's difficult because the wheels of discoveries turn pretty slowly in countries that are currently war zones. But I think my favorite, more recent discovery is the work that's being done in an Anatolian city, which is southern Turkey, the city of Karnash. Well, it's not the city. The city is called Tepe. The region is called Karnash, which is an Akkadian outpost, a trading outpost that has some great evidence for functional literacy, which is something I really enjoy. So the idea that not everyone had to be a super highly trained scribe to read and write cuneiform, which is difficult, but that people had their own like shorter working repertoire of signs so they could communicate with each other. And you have great letters between families, between, like, generally speaking, husbands living in Turkey and wives and children living in northern Mesopotamia. There are some quite amusing, kind of semi-poignant letters from wives basically saying, when are you coming home? It's been like 20 years.
Well, and that's something that you guys get to deal with as professionals, right? Like, you get to see that more intimate kind of depiction of things, whereas, in the stuff that the lay public gets to consume, like, it's mostly focused on the big epic mythological things that can be summarized, which I didn't get a chance to ask you guys about the monomyth. We're going to have you guys on again so that we can hear you rail against Joseph Campbell.
my favorite parts are when you do bring in, like, the people from the fields, and they are going into those intricate little details. Those little details is like what I mean. To me, it just lends an authenticity of the reality that they lived back then.
The details are the best, and especially when you have like my first year Akkadian class, my professor brought in this letter, and I love reading letters. Like, ancient letters are fascinating because they're so deeply humanizing for people that you often only see as like these kings, these mythological figures, conquering cities and conquering other people.
Well, and they're often long and very intricately detailed, right? Because this might be, they couldn't call each other up or text each other. Like, this might be the only communication they have for upwards of months at a time. So you get like this deep, intimate history.
Well, actually, what you do, especially with the Kanash stuff, what you get is the opposite, because you had to pay so much to get a letter delivered that they're small. Like, so you get this really short, terse set of information, and then you have to kind of piece the whole story together based on the other letters that were sent, and the like accounts. Ancient accounts can be really, really full of information that you kind of have to data mine to really get behind what's happening. But you have to use all of this evidence to, like, build up a proper picture of who people were and what they were doing. But the stuff I really love is things like this letter that my professor brought in. And we were translating through it. You, typically speaking, will translate before going into class, and then you go into class and present your translation and make sure you've got it right. It was this guy writing to, I think, his uncle, saying, "Thank you for the delicious rats. Please send me some more," which was fantastic. It was absolutely fantastic. And it's those little kinds of things that you don't typically get when you visit a museum. No one tells you about the rat's letter.
Had I known that they were so delicious, I would not have sent on the...
I wouldn't have given them away to my friend. I'd have kept them all for me.
And that same rat can be used as a okay, well,
what comes to my mind is Demolition Man, of course. So.
Oh yeah.
Rat burgers.
Yeah, there's I've actually got kind of a little bit of personal experience with this. I collect very old books, and one of my favorites in my collection that, being a collector, I of course love to show it off when people come over to my house. One of my favorites that I pull out, it is a travel guide from the 1910s. It was published, I think, in 1911. And it's called All About Going Abroad. And in the back, there's this journal. And in my copy, somebody in 1924 did a road trip across the US, and they tracked their expenses, and they kept this relatively detailed, in some places kind of hard to read because it's that really tight cursive that everybody wrote back then, but they kept this really detailed journal of their experiences. And so, like, even though this book isn't valuable in terms of, like, gosh, when I look back on it, it's like this window into somebody else's life who I'll never meet. But there's like all these intimate details. Like it was a woman, and she talks about how hot Texans are when their car broke down, and how this nice, shapely Texan man like helped fix up their car, and how expensive gas is getting, and it's like cents per gallon and stuff like that. Like, it's just those little sorts of windows can humanize what feels like just this big great man narrative of history. We forget that there were people that lived.
Well, I think it would be fascinating, because I look at history when I look at history, and I see it as this broad context, and you get the broad context of it, but to actually get letters from somebody 3,000 years ago and see how human beings that you're so far removed through time are, and to see how that they interact with each other, I'd find it fascinating to find similarities, that I couldn't imagine. But to Ali's point, like I've always gotten into that myself. Like if I find something that is a kind of like a documentary that's going to really take me inside a human's experience of what they're going through, I always find those to be probably the most attractive stories for me overall, because I like to know what human beings think.
Yeah.
And, last thing that I'll say is
Oh, you're not off the hook. You got to answer the question too.
oh, that's right. Yeah, that's sure. Well, mine will kind of dovetail into this then. So, when you think about a 3,000-year-old letter, right? And actually the ones we're talking about are closer to 4,000 years old.
Oh yeah, that's a long time ago.
You're picking up the tablet, and you look at it and you can see fingerprints from where the scribe held it.
Or there are a couple with like dog tracks. And
or like cat footprints on papyrus and stuff too.
And there are some school texts where we've got what looks like kids doodling, and then someone took a bite mark out of one. It's just
stuff that parents go through today, right?
Exactly. And I'm like, I can relate to this.
Yep. And some of the texts that I dealt with in my dissertation, there are these tablets that if you were to write the word dogs as it is pronounced and not as it's spelled, you would write it D-O-G-Z, because we pronounce it dogs. So they say it's writing that out phonetically. These texts that I was working with, they're written out phonetically. So they're written as they would be pronounced. And what's interesting about it is, in trying to figure out if there were patterns involved, is there a system that they use, whatever, I ended up looking at a bunch of different texts. And one of the texts that I found was a school text. And without going into really any detail about this, because everybody will fall asleep, they used a sign, a cuneiform sign that was really odd to use in a particular situation. Cuneiform signs can be read different ways. So the ka sign can be read ka, it can be pronounced zu, it can be pronounced giri, it can be pronounced, a bunch to inim. Well, they needed to write the zu sound, but instead of writing the syllable zu, the sign zu, which was really, really common, it's what everybody used, he used the ka sign for zu tu. Zu tu means tooth, right? There's nothing but it was a student showing off. He was saying, I know all these signs so well that I'm going to use the ka sign to write the zu sound. And it was really fascinating, because you can see, kids, puffing their chests out and say, look how good I am at this. And
it's
that's kind of like when you if you've ever been in a room full of creative writing majors, it's like the kid who rambles about a sunset for 2 hours and then ties it back into the plot just because he wants to break the rules.
Right.
Or people who create excuses to have their characters waking up as the opening scene. Like, those are all inside writers' jokes, but you get this really flowery language that it's like the person is showing off.
Yeah.
I mean, as a person that just loves history, I have to say I'm jealous of you guys, because you guys are living. You get to feel it and touch it and see it, and man, it's I can't even imagine just like how much schooling and time you guys have put into it. But I'm grateful that you did, and I'm grateful for your channel. I want to let you guys get back to your lives. I really appreciate you coming on. I think that this was a great interview. This was a lot of fun.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much for inviting us. Yeah. This was awesome.
A lot of fun.
Ali, any last words?
Well, I had a really good time too. Thank you guys so much for coming. We need to have you on more often, honestly. I know you guys both get super busy, but the last time you guys were on, I wasn't there and I didn't get a chance to talk to you.
Well, I mean,
but
Dr.
this has
Josh
been wonderful.
offered me to, like, anytime you want me to come on a stream, just holler, and I get so OCD and obsessed that I get sidetracked. But yeah, I definitely want to get you guys on. This was I just love this. I could talk about history forever.
Awesome.
Well, and I think I'd love to go into the monomyth at some point because that's a personal bugbear of mine. And at some point, I want to do a video series on why it's crap because it's so heavily based in Greek and Roman mythology, and it ignores so many things. And so I'd love to hear your guys' perspective as actual scholars and not just angry writers who, are angry on the internet.
I suspect it would be very similar.
And you know what? Like, that validation, I'm not gonna lie. I assumed it would be there, and I was right. Yay. But yeah, thank you guys so much, especially for the sort of unexpected deep moment where we were talking about identity and things like that. That's kind of a big theme of our channel, where we talk a lot about the activism work that we do. Knock is very harsh, and he does piss off a lot of Christians and a lot of fundamentalists, but at the same time, when we have these one-on-one conversations, when we do the interviews with, the more fundamentalist Christians, we do try to dive deep into these things. It's about connection. And it's interesting that when I asked you both what the thing you're most passionate about in your field is, you both talked about that human connection. It runs through all of your work. It runs through the way you communicate. It ran through this entire interview. And I think that it's what makes you guys unique. The fact that you have such a deep focus on that you are connecting to these people from thousands of years ago. And so, it's also amazing that you could have the patience to do what you did with that Twitter person, and connect to somebody who's here and now through text. Like, it's brilliant. It's what we do as writers. It's what we do as creators. And I think that it's something that the community forgets sometimes when we're trying to take down bad ideas, that there's a person behind that idea.
Yeah. So, thank you guys for coming on.
Thank you.
And we'll definitely do this. And next time, we'll give you plenty of a chance to maybe read up on the history Ali wants to talk to you about. I could just ramble on for history for hours. So I want to thank you guys for coming on and doing this with us. And their link is in the description below. If you, for some reason, have not subscribed to Digital Hammurabi, what is wrong with you guys? I do not have my closing stuff set up. I was doing all this new stuff today, so I've still got a lot of setting up to do. So no closing.
I can beatbox you out if you want.
Yeah. You can do your Hovind.
Oh, well, thank you all very much for coming. It's been quite a time. So, okay, perhaps the next time this stream starts, we'll have evolved. Okay, it'll be a little bit better. I'm sorry, I'm Hovind out.
Can you Hovind our closing line if you remember what that one is, Dr. Josh?
Probably not.
Be the conversation.
So just everybody remember, as we head out, make sure that you be the conversation. Okay, we're just trying to help.